Yeah, I'll turn it off after I do the introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this session, moving on from frozen desktops, mandatory profiles in a lab environment. Our speaker today will be Alex Baker from the University of Kansas.
Everybody hear me? Okay, great. Okay, so this is moving on from frozen desktops, mandatory profiles in a lab environment. Good start. Lag. There we are. Introduction. Of course, you guys aren't seeing that. I'm not seeing the same thing as coming up here. There we are. Thanks. Okay, introduction. I'm Alex Baker. I work in a unit called Public Computing Services and Information Technology at the University of Kansas. We support the public computer labs that aren't otherwise controlled by specific departments. On top of that, we also take care of the centrally scheduled classrooms computers. All told, we manage about 750 machines scattered across KU's main campus. So the thing that brings us here to this presentation today, we had a problem. For many years, we used deep freeze to keep our lab machines in a uniform state for all of our users. With Windows 7, we'd have people log in within a couple of minutes, which wasn't great, but it was okay. But when we moved to Windows 10, our fleet of old desktop computers with conventional hard drives would start taking 4 minutes on an ideal login in order to get into the machine. And by an ideal login, I mean we let it sit 5 or 10 minutes, load all of its background components, and then try to log in. If you just turn the machine on and tried to log in that way, we got times as long as 8 minutes on our OptiPlex 990s. And on our worst machines, our OptiPlex XEs, we had a high score of 14 minutes one time. So even after you logged in, we had more problems in the sense that you might get the desktop, but you click on things and they're not responding because the system is currently running scans, doing updates, otherwise trying to make itself secure for the next 5 or 10 minutes. And this would happen at every reboot because you were using deep freeze. As far as the machine knew, it hadn't been looked at or taken care of in a week. So for a while, to get around that worst case scenario, we actually turned off the ability to shut down or restart the computers at all using a group policy. And we still got a lot of complaints from students using the labs. And we were not in a position where we could just replace all of these conventional hard drives with solid state drives. So we had to change something in our methodology. Now that I've laid out the problem, let me go back and say how we did things, the old way of doing it. You would image and configure a computer, get everything picture perfect, generate a new deep freeze client installer, keep that and the password for it somewhere safe. Install that client on a target machine, probably using SCCM or Altiris or some other method to get it out to all of your machines. And then set up a weekly maintenance time in the deep freeze console for OS and third-party updates. And after that, you start dealing with the problems related to this approach. Machines that get behind week after week on their updates because they have more than they can do in the allotted maintenance window. Machines that brick themselves because they get to the end of the maintenance window and they're in an update that takes multiple restarts and freeze themselves back. The inability to use SCCM and the Software Center to push updates, third-party programs to the computers because that only works, of course, when the machine's unfrozen. Longer login times due to the overhead from the deep freeze client running on the machine. And like I talked about before, that greater period of unresponsiveness even after you get the desktop because the machine, you log in, it sees, oh, it's been a week since I've had any updates, and your virus scan software and your Windows Update all monopolize system resources while they try to get everything into compliance. And again, this happens every single time you reboot because the machine's frozen. There was also the cost associated with licensing deep freeze and the time spent configuring and using it to keep the machines secure. So we needed a new methodology, a new way. The old way did work pretty well for a number of years, but when we moved to Windows 10, changes in how Windows 10 behaves led to all these problems. So compared to Windows 7, Windows 10 front loads a lot of the housekeeping that you would have for a new user profile to that very first login. It builds databases, it provisions apps, otherwise gets things in order for faster subsequent logins. Of course, with a lab environment with deep freeze, every login is going to be that first, so people get that worst case scenario. You know, they're waiting 4 to 8 minutes. Other issues that helped us to move away from deep freeze were we had various different versions of the deep freeze client in use across campus with different unlock passwords, and there were again the licensing costs for deep freeze, and we generally needed to start looking for a way to optimize our lab image and improve the user experience. We found that removing unnecessary provisioned FX packages did make an appreciable difference in login times, but that wasn't enough to make things what we call responsive. It wasn't until we combined optimizing the AppX provisioned packages with using a mandatory profile that we got the times that we considered acceptable. So what is a mandatory profile? In Microsoft's own words, a mandatory user profile is a special type of pre-configured roaming user profile that administrators can use to specify settings for users. With mandatory user profiles, a user can modify his or her desktop, but the changes are not saved when the user logs off. The next time the user logs on, the mandatory user profile created by the administrator is downloaded. So that's a lot of the functionality we wanted out of deep freeze right there. There are two types of mandatory profiles. You've got normal mandatory profiles and super mandatory profiles. With a normal mandatory profile, if for whatever reason the computer cannot reach wherever you're keeping that mandatory profile, it will fall back to the default profile of the machine. Super mandatory profiles are almost the same thing, except if you can't reach that stored copy of the mandatory profile, the user is not allowed to log on. That's great if you want to keep users from being able to fall back to default or temp profiles, but if you have a lab environment that doesn't have rock steady network connectivity, you're going to set yourself up for headaches. So, benefits of mandatory profiles. Mandatory profiles can be used to set various profile settings like your folder display options, desktop background, groupings of icons on that desktop, the contents of the document folder, language bar configuration for foreign languages, and just can generally be used to create a standardized user experience. Unlike with Deep Freeze and other system restore software, you can install patches, programs, updates, whatever you want really, anytime you want, because the machine remains live. And it is also a built-in part of the operating system, so there's no extra cost associated with using this method. In some ways, it's actually more secure than Deep Freeze because as soon as the user logs off, their profile is discarded. On Deep Freeze, our usual situation was to grant the user's admin access. Say someone logs in, leaves some sensitive documents on their desktop, goes away, next user comes in with admin rights. They can go to that user's desktop that will persist until the restart and grab that sensitive information. With this, as soon as the user is gone, everything they had on their desktop also is gone. And because those profiles are discarded at logout, you don't have to worry about a small hard drive filling up with hundreds of user accounts. So you can continue to use small hard drives and I guess save costs that way as well. So mandatory profiles can be stored on and copied down from a network share. That's kind of the standard way to do it. Anything that you change in that network share copy of the mandatory profile will be reflected on all the machines that use it the very next time they log in. So it's a really easy, effective way to change settings on those lab machines. Alternatively, if you're in an environment where you don't have reliable connectivity, you can copy the mandatory profile down to the local machine and reference it using a group policy on the hard drives of those local machines. And you even get a small speed boost if you go that route, because it doesn't have to download it every time the user logs in. It's already present. But honestly, I've kind of been bearing the lead with this. The real best reason to use mandatory profiles, at least in our case, is that login times are dramatically shorter when you use them. We had our login times drop from a 4-minute login at best case scenarios to about 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes. And the reason for that is that a lot of the things that the Windows profile would have to set up on that initial login, the mandatory profile already has it created or it skips it. So there's also no performance overhead from running Deep Freeze and no need to do the scramble for updates and patches at login. Of course, if you do have a solid state drive in the computer, you'll see a boost. It won't feel as dramatic maybe because you already had good login times, but in general, we get about 35-second logins for new users on our labs with solid state drive. But of course, there are some drawbacks to this. Mandatory profiles can be a bit difficult to configure in modern Windows. If you don't grant proper rights to the mandatory profile, you'll see it load up, you'll get to the desktop, and then you'll find a lot of things are broken. Start menu, documents folder, the search function on the taskbar, notification area, things the user will immediately notice. We've also found that you pretty much have to make a new mandatory profile every time they do a feature pack update for Windows. You'll have the same thing. It'll load up just fine, but then you'll find major components of the operating system don't function. So every time they have a new version of Windows, expect to spend a little bit of time tweaking and learning how the process has evolved. We've also seen a problem with printer mapping when using mandatory profiles. For whatever reason, we have higher incidences of computers logging in and not mapping the printers that are supposed to map as part of a group policy. This does occasionally happen on machines that don't use a mandatory profile, but it's a lot more prevalent on machines that are running it. And we have machines that do map the printer, and then for whatever reason, an hour later, they drop that printer. So we've gotten around that problem by using scheduled tasks to check in every so often and remap that printer. And if we're in a real pinch, you can just run GP update force and the printer comes back immediately. So this is how you actually create a mandatory profile as of Windows 10 version 1709. One thing I do want to say up front is the old Windows XP method of copying an existing user profile that you've customized and then just renaming it and moving it to a share will not work in Windows 10. This will lead to the broken things I was talking about, the start menu, the search function, any of the new universal apps, the Metro apps, the things they've been putting out since Windows 8 will not function if you try to do this. The only officially supported method, and the only method I've ever seen work, is to start with a default profile as the base of the mandatory, and then go in and manually assign extra rights both to the profile folder and to the registry keys under the ntuser.dat file. It also bears mentioning that the default profile is the base of the mandatory profile, so anything that you had set up in that, backgrounds, groupings of icons, language bars, will all come along for the ride on whatever machine you assign the mandatory profile to. So if you have several different versions of your image floating around in your different labs, if you use this mandatory profile, you can get the same user experience on all of those machines, assuming you're using the same mandatory profile. So the method to do this, you go to the control panel, system. I'm talking about the old control panel, not the new settings. And then you go to, double click on system, that brings up a window. And then you check, click on the left side of that window, the link that says advanced system settings. In the window that then appears, which is the one I've got here in the picture, go to the advanced tab, and then under user profiles, you click settings. Also, if you just type sysdm.cpl in the run menu, that'll jump you right to this window. So you click that settings button, you'll get yet another menu or rather window, and only the default profile is going to give you the ability to click copy to. So that's sort of a hint for how they want you to make these going forward. So you highlight that, you click copy to, you'll get then this window right here. You name the profile what you'd like, where you want to put it on the local hard drive. You check that mandatory profile box down there, and then you click the change button and assign rights to the user everyone, and then click OK. Once you've made the mandatory profile folder, you need to right-click on that and go into Properties and go to the permissions and assign these following permissions. You need to make sure that you add all application packages with full control. This part's actually critical. If you don't add this, your start menu will again be broken. You also need to add authenticated users with read and execute rights, system with full control, and administrators with full control. You then need to make administrators the owner of the group, and make sure you apply these access rights to the entire folder and all of its child objects. Once you've done that, inside the mandatory profiles folder, there is a file called ntuser.dat. You need to load up regedit and then load this file under the file menu. You highlight HKey users, then go up to File and choose Load Hive, and you'll be prompted to put in a key name. That can be anything you want. That's just for you to identify this hive that you've loaded up. Once it's loaded, right-click on that hive, named in this case mandatory, and go to permissions, and assign it the exact same rights you just gave the folders. So all application packages full control, authenticated users read and execute, system full control, administrators full control. And make sure you check the box that says replace all child objects, inheritable permissions with entries from this object. You're going to get an error message at that point that says it can't change some of the key entries, but that's okay. Everything that it needs to actually change, it does. And then you need to make sure you unload this hive so that you can do the next step. So you highlight mandatory there in the tree, go up to File, and then you, actually, I'm sorry, I've jumped ahead a little bit. You actually need to go through this registry hive and manually search for every instance you have of the username that created it, that copied it from that default profile, delete the key, and once you've done all of this, then you unload the hive by highlighting mandatory and then going to File, Unload Hive. Once you have the registry keys changed, the last thing to do is find that file into user.dat and rename it to into user.man. That makes it a read-only profile, and it's one of the things that tells the computer it's a mandatory rather than standard profile. You can also optionally delete some of the junk folders and files they make in the process of customizing this mandatory profile. I'd also recommend putting a file called mandatory.txt in the root of that mandatory profile with the date it was created and the version of Windows you created it with. It's both a good way to check that the user's loading a mandatory profile, because this will appear in their profile once they log in, and a good way once you start using several different mandatory profiles to know which one you're looking at, because otherwise it's not easy to tell. And finally, you need to change the name of the profile that contains that mandatory profile with a suffix. Right now, the suffix number is V6. It seems to increment every year or two. I expect in a year or so we'll probably be doing V7. And there you have it, making a mandatory profile in 800 easy steps. So now that you've made a hopefully working mandatory profile, you still need to put in place group policies to make use of it on your lab machines. So the first order of business is to determine where you're going to keep this thing. You can either keep it on a network share, which is really easy to change, really easy to distribute to all of your machines. Don't have to mess with scripts or anything else. Kind of the standard way to do it. Or you can go with a local version that loads a little bit faster. It's always available regardless of whether or not you've got network connectivity. And if you want to use a super mandatory in a situation where you've got a dicey network, that's the way to do it. So to turn on a mandatory profile, you need to enable this group policy: computer configuration, administrative templates, system, user profiles, set roaming profile path for all users logging onto this computer. And when you type in the name for the file you want to use or the folder, make sure that you don't put in that V6 that we did in the previous step. It will not work if you do that. V6 is something that the operating system itself looks at when it's loading up the mandatory profile, and it's a way that you can effectively have several different profiles living in the same directory being called by the same group policy, and Windows itself is smart enough to pick the correct version for the version of Windows that's logging in. There's also one other group policy you absolutely want to have enabled: computer configuration, administrative templates, Windows components, app package deployment, allow deployment operations, and special profiles. If you don't have this turned on, you will not be able to use things like Calculator, 3D Paint, any of the Windows Store type apps normally do not get provision for mandatory profile. So if you can't load up Calculator, that's probably why. And then I'd like to finish up with some more helpful practices and group policies to use alongside the mandatory profiles to make for a smoother experience. These aren't required, but they will make things a little bit faster, a little bit easier for you as the person administrating the lab. So when you're building your OS image, you should use PowerShell to remove as many of the extraneous AppX provision packages as you can. Those are, again, the modern apps that they've been pushing out since Windows 8. Fewer AppX apps means shorter login times, because every single one of those has to be provisioned on first login for every user. Personally, I remove everything except the Windows Store and the Calculator, and we've been doing that for about 18 months, and we haven't gotten any complaints, so I'd say it's safe in most situations. So you would open up PowerShell, and you could use this command here to get the names of the packages installed in Windows. And then you could use one of the package names that this outputs with this command to actually remove the provision package from the operating system image. Here I've got an example of how you'd remove Bing Weather. And once you've removed them, you'd continue along the process of capturing your Windows image as you normally do. I also recommend using a start menu layout file to standardize your start menu. In Windows 7, when you clicked on the start menu, it just showed you basically the directory structure of a directory somewhere on the computer. But in Windows 10, it's actually building a little database and calculating things like your Windows tiles. You know, so they can push the ads and other things that you normally get in the consumer version of it. But if you use the start menu layout file, it doesn't have to think about it. It doesn't have to calculate this. It just loads this file up, and the user can't change what things are pinned to the start menu, and you get a boost in login time on top of that. So to generate a start menu layout file, you would again go into PowerShell and use this command right here. And that would, of course, create an XML file on the root of your C drive. You'd copy that to a network share somewhere, and then use the group policy at computer configuration, administrative templates, start menu and taskbar, start layout to make use of that layout file. And then anything that's got that policy applied will load in, log in faster, and have a nice indestructible start menu for you. Some other GPPs to consider. All of these are located under computer configuration, administrative templates, and group policy. You've got do not log on users with temporary profiles. This is another way to get functionality kind of like a super mandatory profile. If they can't reach the mandatory profile, either on the network or on the local machine, they are prevented from logging in at all. You also can turn off show first sign-in animation. That's that chatty little window when you log in the very first time. If you turn that off, logging gets a little bit faster and I don't know, maybe a little bit less patronizing. I'd also recommend, if you don't have use for Cortana, disabling her, because at first login, she does a lot of indexing. She pushes ads toward the user. Turning her off improves login time and improves performance on the lab machine itself. And on a similar note, turn off Microsoft Consumer Experiences, which gets rid of those ads that pop up in your start menu and in your start menu tiles. Doesn't have to think about what it's going to put there. Doesn't have to download that. Faster login, better performance. And it practically goes without saying, but do not grant your users admin rights on lab machines using mandatory profiles. When in our deep freeze days, we let everybody be an admin. Thinking was, what could they do to hurt the machine? But mandatory machines, or rather machines using mandatory profiles, are still very much live, so an administrator could very easily wreck it. If the user does need something installed these days, we package it for them and make it available in Software Center. So in summary, first-time logins take forever on Windows 10, especially with the extra overhead from system restore software like Deep Freeze. You can improve this considerably by using a mandatory profile. And mandatory profiles can be a bit difficult to set up at first, but they make your lab machines a lot more flexible, and you don't have to sacrifice security to do it. Thank you.
Real quick, is this on? Can you share the slides with us? And can you share the slides with us?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay, and the next thing is, how do you prevent viruses from coming up on the machine and stuff like that?
Same way you always would with antivirus software.
So, like, unlike Deep Freeze that brings it back, you.
Right, right.
So,
yeah, it doesn't get caught and frozen into it like you might see in the old days.
All right. How do you get the?
I don't have it distributed anywhere right now, but if you send an email to me at akbaker@ku.edu, I can give you a copy of it.
We're also going to have the videos available too, I think, on the website eventually. So we're recording it on Zoom right now.
About 20 years ago, we were doing mandatory profiles, and we spent weeks trying to get everything set up so that AutoCAD had the correct permissions to the registry keys and the files,
Right.
and every other little app. Is it still has the software vendors come around to saying, okay, yes, we acknowledge that users don't need administrative permissions yet?
We don't use anything in our lab that requires an admin rights. So if there is something that's still coded to require those, I guess you'd still run into similar problems. But I guess that's more on the vendor side than with the functionality of the mandatory.
AutoCAD is better. Okay, I'm glad to hear that. But there's several others.
I mean, for all intents and purposes, this behaves exactly as a normal profile would. It just throws everything away at logout.
We've actually been using mandatory profiles with deep freeze for the past 15 years.
Good quick login, I imagine.
Especially after we upgraded to SSD.
Yeah, that does help.
When you need to make a new default profile, do you prefer to try to modify the ones that you've already created, or do you go back to a reference computer and create a new, profile?
I get a
and capture
reference
it?
computer of the, that's got the feature pack installed on it. In this case, 1709. I wouldn't start with 1607s. I'd basically throw that away and start fresh with a default profile that started on a 1709 computer.
That's good. Also, I thought I'd let you know I've tested a 1709 profile on an 1803 machine, and it's working right now.
That's
so
good to know.
I don't know how many updates it'll take to break that, but right now
Fewer than we'd like. I'm
it
sure.
works.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Mhm.
How long has KU been running mandatory profiles in their labs?
We've been testing it since about 18 months back, and we've had it in production since last June. So.
And do you guys do normal mandatory or super mandatory?
Normal.
Have you guys looked into mapping printers by registry keys to avoid the inconsistent?
We have,
mapping?
and we kind of get the same behavior. It works until it decides it doesn't want to, and then we clean up with that scheduled task.
And do you guys put it on network, or do you copy it local with group policy, or do you bake it into the image locally?
I don't bake it into the image just for the extra speed boost, because we're working with rather ancient machines at this point. We copy them down using a script to the local machine and reference the local machine's version of the mandatory. And then at shutdown, we have it copy down a fresh version of that. So if somebody's gone into the mandatory and dropped things in there, not that they should be able to because they're normal user level people, but you'll always get a fresh copy from the network at log off, or excuse me, shutdown.
You mentioned that you get your profiles out of the default profile. Do you just use a stock default profile from Microsoft, or do you customize one and then copy it with sysprep?
Personally, I customize it because I'm building the machine anyway. I'm already in there removing things for FX provisions. You do get that full speed boost just using a stock version of it, though. So you can use it either way.
Okay.
Are you seeing any applications getting installed?
No, actually, we've had fewer needs to rebuild machines this year than we have in years past.
So no spyware, no anything gets
Nothing
stuck on
that
the machines.
Sophos has detected. We haven't gotten any unexpected calls from security pointing anything out. Honestly, we had more problems with viruses getting frozen into machines back when we did that.
No caches of files that the students saved that maybe they shouldn't save.
Well, they don't have an ability to get out of their own profile to save things
Oh.
because they only have user level rights. So that cuts down on it. Yeah, by default, our users aren't allowed to do that.
Any more? Okay. Oh.
So as KU gets closer to auto-configuring the OneDrive client after a user signs in, do you anticipate any problems with OneDrive in mandatory profiles?
No, I wouldn't think so. For all intents and purposes, when a user logs in with a mandatory profile, they have a standard user profile. It's just that when they're done using it, it's not retained on the machine. It's thrown away. So anything that's working under a standard user profile should work as expected using the mandatory.
And I suppose my last question would be, why not use the default profiles like a non-mandatory profile and then trash old profiles after like a day with group policy?
Why not do that?
Yeah, why not do that?
Because if you log in normally, it's having to set up databases of things, and it takes longer.
So
The
just to
deep
make it
freeze,
faster.
or not the deep freeze, the mandatory profile acts as sort of a shortcut because it's got things defined already. That mandatory button you saw me check in the walkthrough actually does a few things to shortcut in the login process.
Any last questions? All right, that wraps it up. Alex, thank you.
Thank you
for the presentation.
Well, where is it?